As I was passing through the herb garden this morning, I noticed this plant just covered with insect life. Herbs are a great resource for insects, and as we look at this plant, there's about half a dozen wasp species, at least as many fly species. I've seen weevils, which are a small beetle, spiders, ants, and a little moth. And all these insects are using the nectaries in these flowers. Now, many of the insects that we see on this plant are beneficial insects that are either predators in the landscape or, of course, pollinators, as we see here. Many of our beneficial predators, they gain their protein by feeding on pest insects in the landscape, but they also need a source of sugar. And herb flowers are a great source of those sugars because they have very small flowers and very small nectaries, and many of these insects are what we would consider short-tongued, meaning they need to feed from shallow flowers. So letting some of our herbs flower in our gardens is a wonderful way to attract those beneficials and allow them to work on some of our pests. Now, of course, herbs have many wonderful uses for humans as well. We get wonderful aromas from them and also flavors. And these flavors provide a season-long enjoyment and use for us in the kitchen. And we can extend that flavor into the winter by harvesting and storing herbs. And we're going to look at harvesting some of our plants and drying those today. Now, there's many different plant parts that we use, and I'm going to focus on foliage, but some plants we harvest the roots or the flowers for culinary use. And when we harvest the plants, it's going to depend on the species of plant and also on which part of the plant we want to use. But when it comes to foliage, we can typically harvest all season long, a little bit here and there, and it'll continue to produce new foliage. But for drying herbs, the late summer is a really good time to make a big collection for drying, because as we enter the cooler weather, the quality of those plants tends to decline a little bit. We want to harvest our plants at the peak of flavor and aroma. Now, a few tips can help us get the highest quality herbs. One thing we want to do is avoid flowering. We have some flowers here on our basil starting to happen. And if you've been harvesting all throughout the summer, you probably won't have any flowers. But if you do start to see flower buds appear on your plants, you could just simply snip those off to keep the plants producing. When plants flower, the foliage production declines and the flavor can decline a little bit as well. When we're harvesting plants to dry, we want to harvest those in the morning, around mid-morning, after the dew has dried from the foliage, but before the heat of the sun sets in. And we can actually harvest up to 75% of the plant tissue at any one time. So we could take them really far down. And what I like to do is leave at least 1 or 2 sets of leaves per stem, and that would be what's remaining to produce some new foliage. So you can see here there's some buds, and those are going to grow out. So we can really remove a great portion of that plant for drying. Generally, we can harvest the entire plant for annuals, and we could do that right up until the time of the first frost. But for our perennial herbs, we want to stop harvesting those around mid-September, about a month before the first frost sets in, and that will allow the plants to harden off properly before the winter time and allow that plant to enter the winter in a healthier state. Well, let's look at drying some of these herbs. There are several different ways we can preserve herbs. We can air dry them, we can use a dehydrator, or we can preserve them through freezing. Now, drying herbs, air drying, is the traditional way, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate and talk about today. For air drying, what we want to do is harvest bundles of herbs, and we want to look through, and if there's any damaged leaves such as this, we want to remove those from the plant. We just want to preserve good foliage. We also want to clean about the bottom 1 inch. So I'm going to go ahead and pull off some of the foliage that's at the base of the stems. And what we're going to do is bundle together 4 to 6 stems. And we don't want to put too many together because we're going to need good air circulation in our bundle. Now, if you see insects on your collected herbs, you could just tap them off gently. If the herbs are clean, we don't want to get them wet, but if they're dirty and they need to be washed, we're going to wash them and then spread them out so that they could air dry. You can even take a towel and just kind of tap them and get some of the moisture out. But we want to wait until they're mostly dry before we bundle them up, because a wet bunch can easily rot. So we're going to take several bundles. I'm going to put about 5 together, and we're going to loosely gather them. We want some good air circulation, so you don't want to bundle them too tight, and we don't want to crush the leaves either. And we're going to just put a string around the base of those stems. You can also use a rubber band, and what you want to note is that as they dry, these stems are going to shrink a little bit, so you might need to come back in and tighten your string, or especially if you have a rubber band, you'll want to loop it around again. And then we're going to hang these to dry. Now, sometimes we dry herbs that have seed heads because we want to collect those seeds. Maybe coriander would be a good example. And if you're doing that, what we could do is hang these inside of a paper bag, and that way the seeds will fall into the bag. You can even punch some holes into that bag to allow for good air circulation. We want to hang this in a dry place, out of direct sun, somewhat cool, and allow the herbs to dry very slowly. This slow drying process helps preserve the oils that are in the leaves, and that's where the flavor comes from. So a nice slow process for best preservation. These can look very attractive hanging in the pantry or in the kitchen, but again, find a location out of direct sunlight. So we want to come and check these after about 2 weeks. It can take up to several weeks, but after 2 weeks, check them about every week. And they'll be ready when you could take a leaf off and crush it very easily. That'll tell you that this is sufficiently dry. At that point, we want to remove all the leaves and store the leaves whole. We don't want to crush them until we're ready to use them, because if we store them whole, it preserves the flavor much better. And we want to store those in a dark, cool place out of direct sun and also away from heat. So don't put it right above your stove where we keep a lot of our spices. That actually helps, encourages decline in the flavor. Store them in an airtight container like a mason jar, or you could even use Ziploc bags. And these should keep for about a year. It's always a good idea to label your herbs so that you know, of course, what they are, but when you preserved them so that you know when they're ready to replace. When you're using your dried herbs in a recipe, you want to use about 1 teaspoon of the crushed dry leaves in place of 1 tablespoon of fresh leaves.